I now have the pleasure of returning the favor of the lovely introduction that Mark gave, although he just told me not to make the introduction long because he wants time for the talk. So I'm actually proud and delighted to introduce my old and dear friend Mark Steiner. A person here who certainly needs no introduction, so I won't give him one. Topic: Parsons, Hume, and Maimonides on imaginability and possibility.
I'm such a good friend that I once had a email correspondence with Stuart. It was only after a month I found out it was Stuart Shanker, and I started discussing Judaism. When he answered then about Judaism, I thought it's got to be Stuart Shanker. Okay. I don't have the nerve to do what Carl did yesterday. Just say, okay, I'm going to speak. I'm going to take another 5 minutes. My strategy will be the other one, to make a distinction between the introduction to my talk and the talk. This is my grandfather's strategy. He used to say all the time in Yiddish. You know Yiddish? It means before I start to speak, I'd like to say a few words. When my grandfather used to ask me, so how are you going to make a living? At that time, I was already teaching at Columbia. I used to say, I do philosophy. What is that? Well, I have a colleague where I teach. His name is Professor Parsons. They say his ancestors came over on the Mayflower. And he talks to people who tell him, I'm such a liar that even what I'm telling you now is a lie. So my grandfather answered, from these kind of lies you can make a living? I didn't tell him that a Polish Jew named Teitelboim made a living from this, because I would have had to tell him that he changed his name to Tarski and was baptized. But when I came to Israel, I found out that everybody makes a living from these liars. That's why this is a transcendental argument for having the conference in Israel. Some people ask, why in Israel? I'll explain. For example, in 1988, I read the following ad on the front page of the religious newspaper, Hamodia. I'll let the Israelis read this, and then I will... This means I'm, roughly speaking, all reports of the stand taken by Rabbi X concerning the upcoming election, past, present, and future, are all false. So you see why we have to have this conference here. Now, that was the introduction. It doesn't count. I made a deal with Oprah that the jokes don't count.
Wait a minute.
I would like to begin this tribute to Charles by saying what a privilege it has been to know and even befriend a philosopher of such great scope and intelligence, a great scholar and a great human being, what we call in Yiddish a mensch. Now in Yiddish, unlike German, this is not a trivial judgment or tautology. His penetrating intelligence and fierce desire to know the truth puts him at the very forefront of our generation, yet he conforms in every respect to the definition of the Talmud, who is wise? He who learns from every man. It's in this spirit that I dare to speak for him, before him today, otherwise this would be chutzpah. This talk will be about imagination and its role in the philosophy of mathematics in three important philosophers. Moving backward in time, we will treat of Parsons himself. I sneaked at the Tel Aviv session. So it's a recent picture. David Hume, whoops, there it is. And the great medieval philosopher and legal giant, Moses Maimonides. This is his statue in Cordova, Spain. Now you might say, what do these have to do with one another? It doesn't really matter. I was a colleague of Charles at Columbia. In writing the final for contemporary civilization, professors used to sit around and ask things like, how would you compare Plotinus, Occam, and Kant on the labor theory of value? So another professor would say, I don't know, let's ask them. But I would like to mention that it's actually fitting that we discuss Hume, as his philosophy of mathematics, to a large extent inspired by Berkeley, that's a nice way of saying he stole it, is often neglected. And also because a new translation of the treatise into Hebrew by Iftach Brill and myself has just been published. Do you see my knapsack over there? So here it is. I'm going to give one copy to somebody who can actually read this. And another copy to somebody who probably can't, but I don't know. He says he has a subscription to Aretz. As a birthday present. I overheard Michael saying that he learned Hebrew for his bar mitzvah, so maybe you can consult with him on what it says.
I wouldn't do that.
Okay. Now, what about Maimonides? This is an act of repentance towards, what is this? What am I supposed to do here? To my teacher, Sidney Morgenbesser, Professor Sidney Morgenbesser, another colleague of Charles, who used to urge me to study Maimonides, and I never listened. Now I'm full of regret. Maimonides was actually a good philosopher who could have gotten tenure at the Hebrew University had he stopped publishing in Hebrew and Arabic and sent the chapters of the Guide to the Perplexed individually to peer-reviewed journals in the United States. As a matter of fact, I should mention here, on a serious level, that Charles has been a teacher of many of important players today in Jewish studies and Maimonides from the time that he was at Columbia. We just talked about Mannequin. I believe he taught Joseph Stern and many other people who today are, some of them are my friends, and I consulted with them in preparing this. Now, Moses Maimonides defines the imagination as the faculty which recalls sense impressions after their disappearance from perception, which combines them and separates them from one another. That's almost David Hume's definition of the imagination. Though his epistemological attitude, namely Hume's, towards the imagination is radically different from that of Maimonides. Hume holds that what we imagine is the object of a possible sense perception, since the only qualitative difference between imagination and sense impressions is that the latter is more vivid than the former. Add to this that Hume does not regard violations of law of nature as impossible, since laws of nature are only constant conjunctions which could cease tomorrow. These considerations give rise to what I shall call axiom I. A state of affairs is possible if and only if P is imaginable. Axiom I is the basis of many of the most important and controversial doctrines of the treatise. And we shall see that it is also formulated but emphatically rejected by Maimonides. But first, what is Parsons' view? Here I'm going to get into some deep water. It is clear from reading his mathematical thought on objects that he does not believe that everything possible is imaginable, even in his sense. I think that's pretty clear. since even mathematical intuition is incapable of grounding many mathematical propositions that Parsons would not dream of questioning. We talked about even induction. But he does seem to believe that what is imaginable is possible. Perhaps he would accept Hume's formulation, to be discussed later: nothing we can imagine is absolutely impossible. In his chapter on mathematical intuition, Parsons referred repeatedly to imagination and its connection to intuition when he mentions Husserl, Kant, and Hilbert. I don't have the nerve to discuss any of these people in this audience, so I'm going to focus only what I think Parsons says and try to disconnect it from the history of what he says. Now, he says that he views the intuition that concerns us as founded on perception and imagination. This implies that intuition is not imagination, but is, quote, founded in part on the latter. This doctrine of Parsons is part of an attempt to demonstrate that mathematical intuition is a legitimate foundation for the most elementary part of mathematics. I will argue that, to make even this point, which I myself am sympathetic with, I am very sympathetic to mathematical intuition. Professor Parsons even quotes an article I once wrote defending mathematical intuition against the causal theory of knowledge, which Bill Tate also discussed. So I want to establish my credentials on the right side of the issue, even though the article I wrote was received by one philosopher as an intellectual crime, a crime against the intellect. So I'm glad that Charles was not deterred by that review and used the ideas in his own work. I think it's a great honor for me. But what I want to say is that if he wants to use imagination, aside from intuition, I think he needs to strengthen the traditional notion of imagination to the extent that the distinction between founding intuition on imagination and identifying intuition with imagination becomes moot. Inspired by Hilbert, Parsons considers strings of strokes where the strings are not physical objects but are related to physical strokes as types are to tokens. Parsons speaks of tokens as instantiating types, though there is a puzzling passage in which he talks about a physical string, imperfectly instantiating, the bottom one imperfectly instantiates the one on top. I actually don't understand what it means to imperfectly instantiate something. But it does remind me a little bit of the participation relation of Plato's Republic, if that helps. You know what I mean. Parsons insists that we can perceive and imagine not only the tokens, which he calls stroke inscriptions, but also the types themselves, or the strings of strokes, since the latter are what he calls quasi-concrete. These perceptions and imaginations are the foundation of mathematical intuition, according to Parsons. Now, although there may not be enough material in the world to make indefinitely large tokens or stroke inscriptions, we can always imagine that there is. Hence, imagination can be added to perception as a foundation of intuition. Parsons argues that we can imagine an arbitrary string, that's a string with no imaginable number, and imagine another one stroke being added. And what is imaginable is possible. So that's at least one side of axiom I. Now that's the intuitive foundation of the axiom that every number has a successor. Though some, like Bishop Berkeley, balk at the notion that an arbitrary string is imagined as having any number at all, and Parsons, of course, realizes this, Parsons nevertheless insists that there's nothing wrong with the idea of imagining an arbitrary string inscription, and hence nothing wrong with the idea of imagining an arbitrary string, and even imagining it as having a number, without being able to say what number it is being imagined to have. Parsons recognizes that he needs to show that by adding a stroke to a string, we get a different string than the one we had before, in order to ground the axiom that the successor of a number is not equal to the number itself, or that the successors of two numbers are the same only if the numbers themselves are the same. He argues that, in fact, this is the case, because this is very rough and maybe too rough, but this is what I got out of it. Because when we imagine a new stroke, we can separate it from the old one in the imagination in such a way that the old string remains the same, and thus we have a different one from the one before, at least in the imagination. But here we run up against a famous passage from Wittgenstein's Remarks on the Foundations of Mathematics. Is Bill here? Good. Okay, so here, I was planning to take this out, but I didn't want to give the man apoplexy. Here, I superimposed the one on the other. By the way, this I don't know if you've seen it. This picture is from his notebook, and not from the printed version. In the notebook, this passage follows some X-rated material where he talks about inviting Francis Skinner and what's going to happen. It's you know who Francis Skinner was. This is written in a cabin in Norway after being sick, ill for weeks, both mentally, physically, sexually, everything. And now he's feeling better, and all of a sudden he puts this diagram in the middle of that. You know, I'm half a rabbi. You know, I was very shocked to see I've seen this diagram for years, and I never knew what the context of this is. At any rate, here's what he says. The following might serve as a model of an internal property. Now, when I say 10 strokes necessarily consist of 3 times 3 strokes and 1 stroke, that does not mean if there are 10 strokes there, then they have always got these figures and loops around them. But if I put them in, I say that I was only demonstrating the nature of the group of strokes. But are you certain that the group did not change while you were writing those symbols in? I don't know. But a definite number of strokes was there. And if it was not 10, then it was another number. And in that case, it simply had different properties. I'm not going to go into the explication of this problematic passage. I've been thinking about this passage for many years. I've also published something on what this means. I want to apply this to the Parsons. Similarly, we can ask, if we would like to ground the intuition that every number has a successor on the imagination, by the way, here's the unobstructed passage. If we would like to ground the intuition that every number has a successor on the imagination, it seems plausible to me that one should be able to imagine a long string inscription being extended by one stroke token with the others remaining the same. Now I'm going to do an 18th century Hume thought experiment. Try to imagine the same thing, except that the remainder of the strokes shrinks by one token imperceivably. To me, in imagination, these are the same thing. So this thought experiment, at least it persuaded me, that intuition, remember, I am sympathetic to this notion, don't get me wrong. And how could you not be sympathetic to Charles? But nevertheless, I would like, this is actually chutzpah, I'm going to suggest what I would do in his place. I think he needs more than the traditional concept of imagination. So I don't know what is gained really by saying that intuition is founded on the imagination, over than saying that the axiom that every number, a natural number has a successor which is different, blah, 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 forces itself upon us as true. Using that, I'm sure many people know exactly who said that. Certainly Charles knows who said that. Now, before going on, I'd like to recall that I was honored to share a session with Professor Parsons and Professor Pfefferman. I don't know if you remember this, in Boston in 1998, when I spoke about Wittgenstein's views on mathematical intuition. I believe that Parsons' views of arithmetic are to a large extent compatible with those of Wittgenstein, especially Parsons' idea of the intuition of the quasi-concrete as based on perception and imagination, and his denial that there is intuition of mathematical objects. The main divergence is Wittgenstein's insistence that mathematical propositions must be based on perception and imagination of the surveyable, which is entering into what we just talked about. And this restriction introduces a quasi-finitist element in his philosophy of mathematics, which Parsons evidently does not share, though I would have to actually give a whole lecture on what that means to find out if he shares it or doesn't share it. Let us now return to the imagination. I would like to go back in time and see what happens to mathematics when we really try to found it on imagination in the traditional sense as defined by Maimonides and Hume. So here's Hume's formulation of axiom I. Possibility is identical to imaginability. Nothing we can imagine is absolutely impossible. We can form the idea of a golden mountain and from thence conclude that such a mountain may actually exist. We can form no idea of a mountain without a valley and therefore regard it as impossible. Strangely, Hume nowhere argues for axiom I formally from his basic principle that every simple idea originates in simple impressions, and that simple ideas resemble exactly the impressions from which they are derived. In discussing axiom I, he says, I know the book pretty well by now. It took me more time to translate it than Hume took to write it. Whatever can be conceived by a clear and distinct idea necessarily implies the possibility of existence. And he who pretends to prove the impossibility of his existence by any argument derived from the clear idea, in reality asserts that we have no clear idea of it because we have a clear idea. It is in vain to search for a contradiction in anything that is distinctly conceived by the mind. Did it imply any contradiction, it is impossible it could ever be conceived. Hume is here identifying possibility with conceivability, which he supposes is non-controversial even among rationalists. But he then identifies conceivability with imaginability, since conceiving X is having an idea of X, and for Hume, having an idea of X and imagining X is one and the same thing. This is the closest he gets to a proof. Nevertheless, axiom I is given very heavy use by Hume. It is the basis for some of the most radical positions in the treatise. Number one, that given any event, any other event whatsoever could succeed it. Two, that there could be a perception not in any mind. Three, that space and time are not infinitely divisible, and thus, four, that there are minimal spaces and times, i.e., space and time are granulated, an idea he stole from Berkeley with no attribution whatsoever. That mathematical points thought of as dimensionless are impossible, and that Euclidean geometry is only approximately true. By the way, there are not only this passage, but there's other passages which convinced me long ago that Kant never read the treatise on human nature. In fact, he gives the same example that Kant gives of the shortest distance at 2 points of straight lines, a synthetic a priori. Hume gives exactly the same example to show that mathematical propositions are not, quote, definitions. But that's not my topic today. Now, thesis one is, of course, notorious. Hume used it to eliminate the idea of a necessary connection between events. Thesis two is less well known, but it is used to prove that the existence of, quote, body, i.e., objects that exist independently and outside the mind, is at least possible. In his very difficult Book 1, Part 4, Section 2. I have a discussion of this in my introduction to the Hebrew translation that we did. If anybody wants to see it in English, I'll be happy to supply it. But I'm not going to talk about Thesis 2. Theses 3 and 5 supposedly follow from the fact that there is a threshold to visual and other perception. As we back away from a black disk on the wall, there is a last point from which we see the disk, after which it simply disappears. Since imagination can't go beyond perception, imagined space also has a threshold, and thus there must be a minimal interval. Similarly, mathematical points are unperceivable or imperceivable, hence unimaginable and hence impossible. This is, by the way, a live issue in physics today, as I'm sure many of you know. The non-existence of mathematical points is one of the reasons why Euclidean geometry cannot be true exactly, which is thesis 6. In my introduction, I point out that that actually can't be his thesis because he can't even make sense of what it means to be approximately true when you don't have these ideas. I mean, that's also in my introduction. He would have had to say something much stronger about Euclidean geometry. It's certainly not analytically true. It's not even true. But there is more. Hume directs our attention to a fact of perception. Two lines which appear parallel, when extended sufficiently, appear to converge in the distance. The parallel postulate contradicts experience. Strictly speaking, there are no parallel lines at all. Euclidean geometry is therefore not strictly true. For example, the sum of the angles of no triangle is exactly 180 degrees because the Euclidean theorem which says that they are is based on an inexact postulate. So you might have to get into Cassira and all kinds of other things, but Hume actually said this first. He actually not only holds open the possibility of a non-Euclidean geometry, actually states that the world is not a Euclidean geometry. Now, in my lectures on Hume over the years, and now in the introduction to the Hebrew translation of the treatise, I have raised the following objections to Hume's identification of possibility with imaginability. Consider an old-fashioned clock. Some of you can remember my age, these kinds of clocks. They don't have flashing digits, right? These are called, with some disdain, analog clocks today. We used to call them clocks, and we used to learn how to tell time with angles and how many minutes to the next hour. They don't have that today, just flashing digits. Nobody knows how many minutes you have to the end of your talk. Well, I actually have a quasi-analog device. Now, how does the minute hand move? The minute hand, right? The second hand moves, the hour hand, but what about the minute hand? When I was 8 or 9, hope you'll, this is my first philosophical analysis, so I hope you'll excuse the childishness of the example. I used to gaze at the minute hand of a clock, trying to catch it moving. I never perceived it moving, yet in a minute or so, I perceived it in a different place than in the start. It seemed to me, and I have to admit, still seems to me, that to say my perceptions were of a clock hand, that it never is perceived to move, never seems to be in a process of leaving its place, and yet is perceived to be in a different place from where it was 2 minutes ago, is incoherent. If this is true, this refutes not only the proposition that everything imaginable is possible, but that everything perceived is possible. Much later on, of course, I was introduced to these kind of drawings by Escher, where you perceive things that you know are impossible. There's also the try-by, I didn't have time to put it in. A related comment would be the following. According to Hume, motion can take place only when an object disappears from one atom of space and reappears in another. There would thus be a maximum velocity of 1 unit of space in 1 unit of time. By the way, this was pointed out a long time ago by Max Black. Lesser velocities would be possible if the point particle moves from one point of space to another after waiting 1 or more units of time. Nevertheless, at all perceived velocities, motion can be perceived to be continuous. So my conclusion has been that the extreme empiricist position adopted by Hume is not coherent, since there is no way simply to, quote, report on the deliverances of perception. But recently I was surprised to learn that these issues were debated in the Middle Ages. Maimonides, in a number of his writings, conducts a continuing polemic against the Kalam thinkers. They were mentioned, by the way, in Tel Aviv by the dean of the faculty. He almost stole my lecture. Who were the Kalam thinkers? They were Islamic thinkers and also, by the way, Jewish followers. There were a number of Jews who followed the Kalam, those who know Jewish history. So Sadia Gorin was a follower of the Kalam. Now, these are people Maimonides missed as theologians. Only the Aristotelians are given the honorific title philosophers by Maimonides. Now, a closer look at the Kalam positions which Maimonides trashes reveals that they are Hume's ideas formulated over 600 years earlier. In Maimonides' first work on Jewish law, his monumental commentary to the Mishnah, which he finished in 1168 at age 30, he included an introduction to ethics known as the 8 chapters. The first chapter discusses the parts of the soul in an Aristotelian style, and one of the parts is the imagination. We have already seen that Maimonides defines the imagination more or less as Hume did. The imagination, Maimonides continues, has thus the power to conjure up impossibilities. For example, one of his impossibilities that you can imagine is a flying machine. Well, that's a little embarrassment for Maimonides. Now, another is an animal with 1,000 eyes. He then, by the way, somebody asked me, what about birds? Aren't they heavier than air? The answer is that in the ancient world, live things were considered to lift themselves up. That's why we have a concept of dead weight. You ever hear that expression, dead weight? It means that when a person dies, he's heavier than when he was alive. So birds are not a counterexample to this example. Now he then launches an attack on the Kalamist theologians, or as they generally called in literature, which I can't pronounce, the Muta Kalimun. I put that word in for Joseph Stern, but in the rest of the paper I'll just call it Kalamist. He launched an attack for building their entire sophistry on the principle of basing all the modal concepts, the necessary, the contingent, and the impossible, on the imagination. In other words, what I have been calling axiom I. Now, in his Guide to the Perplexed, Maimonides, in a long chapter, which is Part 1, Chapter 73, which is embedded in a whole attack on the Kalam before and after, he doesn't like them. In fact, I think he had something personal against them, but I don't want to talk about that right now. At any rate, he calls it the Kalam theology. He refuses to call it philosophy, as I said before, because it ignores truth established demonstratively by Aristotle. Now, these are 12 in number. I won't put them all on the... Now, these principles coincide strikingly with Hume's views on axiom I, as well as his views on the atomicity of space, time, and matter. This coincidence includes views that Hume doesn't state, but he is nevertheless explicitly committed to them. It should be noted for the record, if there are any scholars here, that, well, there are actually, that scholars have not been able to identify all 12 postulates in available writings of the historical Kalamists. Indeed, scholars have not found a single Kalamist who set forward all 12. Finally, a very competent scholar, the late Professor Michael Schwartz of Tel Aviv, his sister-in-law, I believe, is here. In the notes, no, he's Mechatenister, not this. In the notes to his Hebrew, Michael Schwartz says in the notes to his Hebrew translation of the Guide, it's a beautiful translation. It's probably the best translation, too bad it's in Hebrew. He repeats several times that no Kalamist he knows asserts what I have been calling axiom I. That's a good one. And some Kalamists assert propositions inconsistent with it. That's so much for scholarship. It is reasonable, therefore, that Maimonides, I checked this with Joseph Stern and other students of Charles, such as I think Warren Harvey was one of them. No? It is reasonable, therefore, by the way, Joseph sends his regards. He has to be in China, like I just came back from. It is reasonable, therefore, that Maimonides, perhaps deliberately, created a caricature of the historical Kalam positions because he wanted to discredit them. I'm not going to dwell here on the reasons for this. He did think that they were hypocritical. In chapter 71, he accuses them of choosing their philosophy in order to prove predetermined positions. Now, we know today nobody ever does that. What Maimonides seems to have done is what Plato did before him in the Theaetetus. He constructed an imaginary and tendentious composite of his opponents, and then tried to dispatch them all in one blow. As for axiom I incline to think that Maimonides held that the known Calamist positions opposing science, mathematics, and causality presupposed axiom 1, whether or not they consciously adopted it. I think that Maimonides' attempted reduction of the Kalam to axiom I gets striking support in Hume's reduction of his own philosophy to axiom I in the treatise. We could say then that Maimonides invented Hume's theory in an effort to discredit the Kalam by reductio ad absurdum. The irony of it all is that Maimonides accuses the Kalamists of deliberately adopting what we today would call empiricism to undermine science in order to leave room for the possibility of miracles, while Hume used the same principle to undermine the belief in miracles. That's how it goes in philosophy. Let's begin with axiom I itself in light of its centrality to the so-called Kalam position. Every time I use the word Kalam, I don't really mean the Kalam, I mean Maimonides' Kalam. According to the Kalam position, Maimonides says the geocentric theory of the universe, an established scientific fact, is not necessary, say the Kalam, because we can imagine a heliocentric universe. I've altered, for the scholars, I've altered this example slightly, but it doesn't make a difference. Similarly, the Aristotelian theory of gravity as motion towards the center is not necessarily true, since we can imagine bodies defying gravity. Indeed, say the Kalamists, the imagination does not distinguish one point of space from another. Hence, there are no singular places, such as the center, in the universe at all. Terrible. What we regard as natural law, the Kalamists say, for example, the falling of heavy bodies towards the center of the earth, is nothing but the continuance of a habit. Have you heard that one? No different in principle from the habit of the Sultan to travel on horseback rather than walking. Of course, the comparison to Hume on this point is inevitable, even in Hebrew. The atomicity of time supports this denial of necessary connections between events, since what happens at each atom of time is independent of what happens at the next one. Maimonides dismisses axiom I, since the imagination is a very crude guide to questions of possibility and necessity. Accordingly, Maimonides says, it follows necessarily from all these premises, namely of the Kalam, or the so-called Kalam, that man is not more fitted to cognize intellectually than a beetle. I was actually trying to put a beetle here, but Google didn't let me, so. To say what is possible and is impossible, to say what is possible and impossible requires grasp of universals. The imagination deals only with particulars. Those familiar with Hume's treatise will recall that Hume, in fact, has exactly a chapter on the reason of animals. Now, not beetles maybe, but other higher animals. Maimonides gives an interesting counterexample to axiom I, a proposition which is not only possible, but necessarily true, though it is not imaginable. So I'm not saying that this is a counterexample to Parsons' notion of the imagination, since at best he accepts only the converse, what is imaginable must in some sense be possible. But the Kalam accepted both sides of this axiom I. Citing Apollonius Conic Sections, Book 2, in those days all philosophers read mathematics. Apparently many rabbis did also. Citing Apollonius Conic Sections, Book 2, He gives the example of the asymptotes of hyperbola, which approach the curve and indeed converge to it, but do not intersect it even to infinity. And he says, this cannot be imagined and can no way enter within the net of the imagination. Of these two lines, one is straight and the other curved, as has been made clear there in the above-mentioned work. Accordingly, it has been demonstrated as something that the imagination cannot imagine or apprehend, and that is impossible from its point of view, in other words, from the point of view of the imagination, cannot exist. Assuming can exist. Just want to check if you're listening. Now, of course, one man's modus ponens is another man's modus tollens, as they say. We have already seen that Hume did not balk at accepting the radical position that Greek mathematics is not true, or is only approximately true, or as I think he should have said, is incoherent. But that's, as I say, it's another story completely. Maimonides gives a counterexample to the other direction of axiom I. He gives an example which he says proves that what is imaginal might still be possible. And the guy doesn't talk about heavier than air flight, thank God. His example cannot be from Aristotelian physics, because we have seen that Maimonides' Kalamist rejected its necessity. So he would be begging the question. So he gave a clever ad hominem argument against the Kalam, namely the incorporeality of God. He takes the Kalam to agree with him that it is a fundamental principle that God has no material properties. Yet, of course we know, the scholars know that God doesn't have any properties at all, but that's another discussion. Yet including existence, by the way. Yet the imagination delivers only material bodies and properties. We cannot imagine an incorporeal God. Hume similarly, but of course with glee, does not exempt the idea of God from the strictures of all ideas which are based on sense impressions. At any rate, we know that Maimonides made a war against the corporealist in his own and other religions. He was the only religious thinker in the whole Middle Ages who held that it is forbidden to allow the masses to believe in the corporeality of God. Not just that he didn't believe it, right? There are a lot of Arab philosophers who didn't believe, but they didn't make a war out of it because they didn't think the masses are capable of understanding these fine philosophical points. He also thought that it's forbidden for the masses to believe in magic and astrology, that's a whole story in itself. How did Maimonides get to astrology? The scholars actually don't know what were his conclusive proofs against astrology. But by the way, his rationalism allowed him to argue this way, because many of the things like magic and astrology in the Middle Ages were considered empirically verified. So if you were an empiricist, then you would believe in magic and astrology. Here was Maimonides' rationalism, which, quote, got beyond the senses, if you will. Anyway, it's possible that one reason for Maimonides' opposition to the Kalam was fear that their theory could lead to the heresy of anthropomorphism and corporealism, which you regard, by the way, as a kind of idolatry, or logically equivalent to idolatry. The Kalam, or Maimonides' Kalam, by the way, I have to say this, that he has an argument in chapter 60 of the first part, the beautiful example in the philosophy of language, where he says that to believe that God has a body is equivalent to saying there is no God at all, because God then is defined by descriptions that are inconsistent with one another. God, corporeality. It's like saying, he says, an elephant. Take an elephant. Imagine that we think of an elephant as a flying animal with 70 eyes and swims in the water and is made out of glass, etc. So a person like that, he says, doesn't have the wrong idea. He doesn't have the wrong attributions about elephants or wrong beliefs. He doesn't believe in elephants at all. FREGE Russell? No, as there are Arab philosophers who had something like the description theory of reference, and you can read Joseph Stern's writing to find out who they were. The Kalam, or Maimonides' Kalam, like Hume, regard not only matter, but space and time as atomic. There's only one velocity, and the illusion of different velocities is caused by the fact that a particle rests for a number of instants before it moves on to the next atom of space. Here it would seem that the Kalam differ with Hume, because in order to explain away why we perceive all motion as continuous and not jerky, the Kalam introduced postulate 12. That's the infamous postulate that says, the senses commit mistakes, and many of the objects of their apprehension elude them. That's how they get out of it. And thus they say in Maimonides' reconstruction, probably malicious reconstruction, in fact, your thinking that a certain object is moving in continuous motion is due to an error of the senses. For many of the objects of the perception of the senses elude the latter, as they lay down in the 12th postulate. One might say that the 12th postulate is in blatant contradiction to axiom I, which is common to the Kalam, Hume, and maybe Parsons, I don't know, we'll see. But notice that Hume himself was forced to introduce something equivalent to this postulate 12 in order to save him from philosophical embarrassment here and there. I will cite an example which is relevant to our subject and which has actually been mentioned a number of times in this conference. Hume, basing himself on what he takes to be sense impressions and axiom I, we have noted, holds also that space and time are atomic and granulated. It would seem that we have here a criterion of identity for the length of intervals, just count the atoms. But Hume demurs from this, however, and he says, but though this answer be just, as well as obvious, yet I may affirm that this standard of equality is entirely useless. For as the points which enter into the composition of any line or surface, whether perceived by sight or touch, are so minute and so confounded with one another, that it is utterly impossible for the mind to compute their number, such a computation will never afford us a standard by which we may judge of proportions. No one will ever be able to determine by an exact numeration that an inch has fewer points than a foot fewer than an ell. If you don't know what ell is, look it up on Wikipedia, or any greater measure, for which reason we seldom or never consider this as a standard of equality or inequality. It's for this reason that Hume denies the possibility of geometrical knowledge, reserving the term knowledge only for algebra and arithmetic, which as I said, I don't think Kant read this passage at all, or anything. Also, I was told by the late Professor Rotenstreich that the treatise wasn't translated into any language that Kant could read. There remain, therefore, algebra and arithmetic as the only sciences in which we can carry on a chain of reasoning to any degree of intricacy and yet preserve a perfect exactness and certainty. We are possessed of a precise standard by which we can judge of the equality and proportion of numbers. And according as they can correspond or not to that standard, we determine their relations without any possibility of error. When two numbers, here we go, am I quoting FREGE or Hume? You'll see. When two numbers are so combined as that the one has always a unit answering to every unit of the other, we pronounce them equal. And it is for want of such a standard of equality in extension that geometry can scarce be esteemed a perfect and infallible science. Something like postulate 12 is needed here to explain away how we perceive space and time on the one hand as atomic, yet are unable to use the obvious identity criterion for intervals. Maimonides' Kalam on this point are on firmer ground actually than Hume, because Hume adopts throughout what I call the transparency of perception. I call this. Everything is in the mind as it appears to be, and uses this principle in a polemical way. All ideas he maintains are grounded in sense impressions. But what does it mean to say that the appearances are of atoms confounded with one another? On the face of it, such a report of appearances would be a rank contradiction. At least that's how I read it. Now, I believe that the Wittgensteinian arguments based on inservability would apply here too if Wittgenstein ever read Hume, but he reported that he couldn't bear to read Hume. though the truth is that I think Saul Kripke has made persuasive arguments that there are deep similarities in many of the things that they say. Obviously, Hume didn't read Wittgenstein either. Now, the Kalam, even Maimonides' Kalam, never adopted such an extreme empiricism and never actually said that all ideas are generated from sense impressions. Now, Maimonides cites the following objection to the Kalamist theory of space and time. I call this the Maimonides-Kripke disk. Kripke doesn't know that. Kripke uses this disk in order to refute Quine's theory of identity criteria. I heard him here said, because when the thing rotates, space doesn't change really. Everything is the same qualitatively, right? So Kripke actually revealed his real metaphysics, that all you have is stuff moving in a void, or something like that. Not atoms moving in a void, but stuff. But I won't get into this is the Maimonides disk. Consider a rigid disk, a millstone rotating at constant angular velocity. A point close to the center moves more slowly than a point on the circumference, which means on the Kalam hypothesis that the point close to the center rests while the point on the circumference is moving, contradicting the experienced rigidity of the disk. This objection is an attack not only on axiom I, but on the coherence of raw imagination. Axiom I implies, as Hume says, that there must be a limit to the division of matter, since the infinite divisibility of matter is not imaginable, because not perceivable, while atoms are imaginable. At the same time, we can imagine a rigid disk. Maimonides, in effect, is saying that the imagination and pure sense perception, uncorrected by the mind, gives contrary indications. So in giving my arguments against Hume's theory of the imagination based on the clock, I really should have known that Maimonides preceded me by hundreds of years. I was very embarrassed when at age 65 I really started reading the Guide to the Perplexed. I was so embarrassed that I thought of going to his grave in Tiberias and begging forgiveness. But then I realized if I did that, he would turn over in his grave. So I couldn't even do that. Now the next objection to the Kalam involved their horrific denial of the exactness of Euclidean geometry. The opinions which Maimonides attributes to the Kalam would almost make it seem that Hume read their work. Furthermore, he says, the doctrine that I have mentioned to you with regard to motion is not more abhorrent than the assertion going with this view that the diagonal of a square is equal to one of its sides, so that some of them say that the square is a non-existent thing. To sum up, all geometrical demonstrations become invalid, and they belong to either one of the other of two categories. Some of them are absolutely invalid, as for instance those referring to the properties of incommensurability and commensurability of lines, planes, and the existence of rational and irrational lines, and all that are included in the 10th book of Euclid and those that resemble them. As for the others, the demonstration proving them are not cogent, as when we say we want to divide a line into two equal halves. For, in the case in which the number of atoms is odd, the division of line into two equal parts is impossible according to their assumption. The account of the infinite which Maimonides attributes to the Kalam is thoroughly Humean. Of course, he's not Hume, right? He's against Hume. But he attributes Hume to Kalam. He actually made up Hume's philosophy. Aristotle, of course, rejected the actual infinite, but notoriously accepted the potential infinite. In fact, I feel it's one of the central applications of his distinction between the potential and the actual. In his physics, for example, he speaks of an infinite chain of Olympic games. At no time do we have a history of infinitely many games, but at the same time, it's always possible to add another event. Right? You could call it stroke arithmetic of Aristotle. Now, both Hume and the Kalam deny all kinds of infinities. The interval, as we have seen for both of them, is not infinitely divisible, even potentially, since the division ceases when we hit an atomic interval, nor is time infinite in the sense of infinitely divisible. As far as the infinitely large, I won't discuss that here. He has a whole thing about infinitely large, which I will not get into. Also, he has a thing about the microscope. What do you do about the microscope? And all that stuff. I'll leave that for now. Right? So, both Hume and Maimonides claims that here axiom I suits their theology, talking about the Kalam, because they wanted to eliminate even the possibility of the world being eternal in either direction. So he accuses them of choosing their philosophy to suit their preconceived notions. Now this leads me to an interesting point. I'm glad Carl is here because this is somewhat, is he still here? Yeah. Somewhat, I was reminded of this when he was talking about this Kripke model. All Maimonides' counterexamples to axiom I involve examples of possibility that are actually also examples of necessity. The properties of the asymptotes of the hyperbola are possible, but what's the reason? They're necessary. He never gives an example of a proposition that's contingent, i.e. possible but not necessary, which is unimaginable. Why not? The reason I think, that's just a conjecture, that for Maimonides, as for Aristotle, and this is not a conjecture, this scholars believe, what is possible is that which will be actual in the fullness of time. The Kalam, however, didn't believe in the fullness of time, so counterexamples like that would beg the question. We can now take stock. Maimonides' attack on the imagination as a guide to possibility includes an argument which purports to show. This is the last page. You see this? I'm nothing up my sleeves. And no, this is my last sentence. None of that stuff. This is the last page. Okay? Maimonides' attack on the imagination as a guide to possibility includes an argument which purports to show that raw imagination, unaided by the mind, gives an incoherent picture of the world. In my opinion, similar arguments can be brought against Hume's extremely reliance on the imagination to arrive at a non-Euclidean mathematics identical to the one that repelled Maimonides in the Middle Ages. We can add to these arguments some Wittgensteinian considerations that show that founding mathematical intuition on perception and imagination of types can work only if we strengthen the concept of imagination to such an extent that it almost becomes indistinguishable from the intuition it is supposed to found. Again, this is not an attack on mathematical intuition. I said this twice, I say it again. I'd like to end with some more personal words. To attend this conference, I cut short my stay in a place called Guangzhou, China. I don't know if you ever heard of it, but it happens to be the third largest city in China with 13 million people, where I delivered no less than 15 3-hour lectures on Wittgenstein's philosophy of mathematics. Probably Professor Tate thinks these were 15 too many. After the last lecture, a young woman got up, a graduate student, and with a trembling voice thanked me not only for teaching them Wittgenstein, but also for teaching them what philosophy is. That's kind of embarrassing. I don't know how justified that tribute was, but certainly we all here can say thank you to Charles, who has taught us all not only philosophy is, but also what it used to be. Thank you.
Well, I've kind of, in one of the rare cases where I lost my cheerly duties by getting lost in the talk, I completely lost track of the time. Where are we, Ofra?
We completely lost track of the time.
All right, so
Supposed to be at 12:30, right?
Right, so we're just using up Michael Glenn for time.
Yeah, I certainly don't believe as a general proposition that what is imaginable is what's imaginable is possible. Fictional examples would abound, things that are recounted in fairy tales. Now, those cases, however, all involve a kind of different version of the real world. We're talking about actual things there is cause and effect in fairy tales, but it behaves in a way that contradicts known laws of nature. Now, are the considerations that I advanced for the proposition that every string can be extended, or there's an application of this principle that what's imaginable is possible?
Yeah? I think we have to say
Not
that.
not anything like the
Yeah.
cases that I referred to as counterexamples, or
Right.
some of the counterexamples from Maimonides that you cited.
Right.
Because because there isn't a question of reality here, but a mathematical possibility. Maybe that's a problematic notion, but I don't think. So, in any case, I think that imagining an arbitrary stroke and seeing that it can be extended. Now, there are other objections to that have been advanced here, but let's suppose those objections can be met. I don't see why it shouldn't establish the kind of possibility that's needed for that purpose. About the idea that intuition can be founded on imagination, of course, I was using the term founded as it's used in Husserl. Maybe I can't get back my grip on how Husserl used that term right.
How did you use it?
Right at the moment.
But actually, I wanted to ask you something else. What if, I'll grant you that you can add a...
Yeah, in the more straightforward case, intuition of the type is founded on perception, actual perception. That is, so to speak, underneath one's intuition is a relevant perception. So underneath the intuition in the imagination case is an imagination. So it isn't an epistemological foundation. It's, I suppose you could call it metaphysical. I don't think that's right either.
Could always call it phenomenological.
Okay, phenomenological.
That clears it up.
I'm not troubled by this worry in that Wittgenstein passage because it seems to have to do with reality. How do you know that one of the strokes didn't disappear, that is, pass out of existence? But maybe there's an argument that I should be troubled by it. It maybe has some relation to what Mark van Affen was talking about, saying yesterday about the same. Well, I've gone on about this and not getting, but other people should have a chance to say something about Maimonides, which, in spite of having been involved in Joseph Stern's thesis on
Oprah, how much time should we allow?
Looks like people are opting for lunch.